What's up everybody, I'm Derek, this is Rocking eForge, and it is rapidly approaching one of the best holidays of the year, Halloween. So in honor of spooky season, I am going to be showing you how I forge a simple skull. So let's get rocking. And the first thing I'm going to be doing is simply just squaring up this piece of stock because it works a little better if you've got a mild square on it. Now it doesn't have to be perfectly squared, you don't have to have sharp corners, and in fact I'd recommend you don't. But I'm just going to square this up a little bit and then get it back in the fire for the next step. And now I'm just going to square up about 4 inches of this, but the amount that you want to work with is going to vary by how thick your piece of steel is. All right, so the next step is you want to bring this to once you've got it all squared up the way you want it, you want to bring it to the far edge of the anvil and just start hammering into a 90-degree bend. And if you want to true up that bend to closer to 90 degrees, feel free to strike the end, and that'll help kind of move that mass downward toward the face of the anvil and square up this corner a little bit. The idea here is you want this bent section to be a little, anywhere from 1 to 2 times the thickness, because this is going to become the back of the skull. And the next step that we're going to jump into is just simply to upset this down into a more rounded and wider and thicker shape in order to become the back of the skull. We're going to accomplish that by lying what's going to be the face of the skull on the flat face of the anvil and hammering down into that skull to upset that back in. And you may have to adjust, like I'm about to, that 90-degree bend, and that's okay. And as you're doing this, you're going to get a little bit of mushrooming. And some of that is okay, because some of that mushrooming can actually make the skull end up looking kind of cracked and aged and old. But what you want to start doing as you get that mushrooming is just start to kind of hammer it in by rolling the piece around on the anvil and hammering down at different angles. And you'll have to get pretty creative with how you use the different faces and corners and edges of your anvil and the angles that you strike at with your hammer in order to make this look not like not like this. And this may take a little bit of time and a lot of practice. And don't stress out if it doesn't work out too perfect, because the face of the skull will make up for a lot of that really interesting texture and stuff that you're getting. Like I said, creative. So this looks pretty good, but I think I want to get it a little flatter in the face area, because this slopes quite a bit down the skull, and I've made plenty that look like this, and it works out pretty all right. But I think what I'm going to do is the next heat, I'm just going to come in and just hammer its face right into the face of the anvil. So that got the face pretty flat. And I simply want to tuck the rest of the skull back and finish up everything by planishing. Now notice here, there is a little bit of imprints from the edge of the anvil at the base of the skull, and that'll work its way out as you forge the face in using your different tools. All right, so now that we've got the back of the skull forged in, and you can use my lovely profile as an example, cringe. It is time to move on to forging the face of the skull. Now, in order to forge the face of the skull, you're going to need at least 3 tools. And that is going to be a ball end punch, a center punch, and a hot cut chisel. Now, those 3 tools are required to get the eye sockets, the nasal bone, and the teeth, respectively. Now, a tool that is not required but could prove useful is some sort of rest to lay the skull on in order to keep it from moving around and wiggling around and bending in the post vise. And I'm going to make that out of a piece of 3-ish inches of this angle iron. Now the first thing I'm going to do is cut here maybe a 1/4 inch from this edge of the angle iron in order to give me a little piece of material that I can bend in and then fold around so that it will actually sit between the jaws of the vise and the actual piece that I'm working on and clamp everything together so that nothing moves around. Now this is the idea that I'm going with here. The base of the skull sits on the back of this piece of angle iron, and then this all clamps together in the vise. And I'm thinking just by trying to do that, this little stick needs to come out a little bit further so that it's a little closer to in line with the jaws of the vise. That way when it clamps onto the side of the piece, I don't have to have it straight up and down, which makes it hard to get into the right angles for forging all of those individual features on the face. And I'm going to use the step of the... No, I'm not. All right, I think that'll work. So let's go try it out in the vise again. Oh, I did that the wrong direction. Whoops. Might be a little too far. I want this to be in the jaws of the vise while this is sitting here by itself. So that when I close the jaws of the vise, I'm not trying to fiddle with it while I'm trying to also hold the hot, forging temperature piece that I'm trying to wedge in here. And I think opening that up or bringing this just slightly further down into the jaws of the vise is going to do that for me. Third time's the charm. That looks better. All right, so now let's try it with this. I'll have to get rid of a lot of this extra material I've got because it wants to just lift everything. And you can see there's a little bit of a gap here, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not too bad. I think once I eliminate a lot of the excess material here that's weighing it down and trying to rotate it that direction will help alleviate that problem. But it moves ever so slightly, but it doesn't bounce away from the skull as you're pounding on the face. And this will give me a nice little backstop and an angle to forge against when I'm coming in with my tools to forge in the features of the skull. And you can see this is cooled down. I let this cool down to make it easier to mess around with. I'm going to use my center punch to go ahead and kind of start laying out where I want the eyes to be. And I always start the eyes when I'm making a skull because once you've placed the eyes, then you can figure out where the nose looks best and the teeth from there. And this is a good reason why having a flat face right at the beginning helps, because it kind of helps you set up where your initial punch marks are going to be. And I'm just doing this by eye. I've got a little bit of an angle between the two, so this eye is going to be higher than that eye, and I will show you how to fix that because this is not a big deal, because you can angle your punch in order to move one direction or the other. All right, so we are coming in for the first heat, and I just want to, first things first, start using the center punch to deepen the eye sockets a little bit and start moving those in line with each other. Because going straight from the tiny center punch mark that I had straight into the ball end punch would make it fairly difficult to try to find those spots and seat that. But now we can move to the ball end punch and start getting those worked in. You can tell I'm just angling the punch every so often to adjust the eye sockets back into alignment. And you want to continuously do that because every single strike is going to be a little bit off and a little bit different. And you want to make sure not to come in. This is a lesson I learned early on in my smithing, is that you should never strike multiple times without pulling the punch away and looking at it and then putting it back and reseating it solidly in the hole that you've started. Because as I'm sure you just saw, you will walk your way out of that hole and down or sideways or whatever and end up with just a wandering divot in your piece, and that will be very difficult to overcome. Now you want to just go ahead and start pretty slow, and once you've kind of got the eye sockets readjusted to being back in line, you want to just go straight into the skull. You don't want to go at an angle just yet. You want to get the sockets deep, and not miss the tip of your, and not miss the hammer end of your punch. And that's starting to look good. And you will notice as you go, the sockets, the outside of the skull will start to spread outward because you're spreading with that ball and punch in each eye socket, and that'll kind of add to the shape of the skull, and it'll look really good as you keep going. And I'd say this is looking pretty good. I think I'd like to make it a little bit deeper, and it just occurred to me how long of a forehead this guy's gonna have. As you can see, these eyes are pretty low. It would have been more accurate for a human skull to put them up here or even higher, but that's okay. So I'm gonna keep making these eye sockets just a little bit deeper, and I'm gonna start, the next heat, I'm gonna start coming in, hitting one deep, and then angling one out to start pushing that eye, the rim of the eye socket out and kind of shape the skull a little more. All right, so now is when you can come in and just tap without worrying about it wandering. And I'm just coming in and trying to even out the eye sockets there. The next step will be to bring back the center punch, and I'm going to start on getting the nose. All right, so the key for making the nose here is to deepen this 1 or 2 strikes straight in, and then start angling up toward the forehead. The goal here is to use the tip of the center punch to dig in and then make the steel kind of bend out or fold out to create the nasal bone. And I'm just slowly working my way deeper and then pushing that material up. All right, so you can kind of tell I've got a little bit of a burr built up there as the nasal bone right between the eyes. And it's looking pretty good. This kind of big divot ended up a little bit big for my taste, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it looks pretty good. So the next step is to start working on the teeth, and I'm going to bring this just to the horn of the anvil and start working that down a little skinnier, because the human skull skinnies up at the teeth, and as such I'm just going to try to work that up into the cheeks as much as I can, and I'd say that's looking pretty okay. But here is a cautionary tale of not getting your piece too hot. As you can see, I've got a bit of a depression here from the tail on my little angle iron clamping device or support device that I made. That's because I got all of this material here to an orange heat, and then I pressed that tail into the steel by clamping it tightly in the jaws of the vise. I'll either grind that out or hammer that out one way or another. It won't make a huge deal. As you can see, I've also got a bit of spreading here, and so next heat I'm going to bring this just to the far edge of the anvil and hammer that down a little flatter very carefully. Now, as you can see, I've got some pretty sharp corners, and as it so happens, the human jawline has no extremely sharp corners. So I'm just going to go ahead and knock those corners down using the rounding face of the rounding hammer here. I'm using the rounding face because there's just a little bit of a swoop from the cheekbone out to the jaws here. And that gave us a nice little touch up in the area where the nasal opening was just a little too wide down there at the bottom. And that gives us a little more room to go ahead and chisel in the teeth. All right, so the next step here is to just come in with that hot cut chisel and put a big mark as close to flat across the face as you can. And this is another thing that you can adjust just by giving yourself a little bit more angle. The next step is to come in and just kind of lay the corner of the chisel in that channel that you just developed, and just chisel a tooth, the separation of the teeth. Ooh, and make sure, unlike that one, that you don't go too shallow and end up chiseling in the teeth directly into the face. All right, so this is looking pretty all right. I don't like the teeth as much as I usually do, and I think it's because I use such thick stock here that it ended up being just extra wide. I didn't go deep enough with the hammer on the horn to kind of slim down the face. I think these look best when you've got about four to 6 teeth across the top and bottom total. Looks like we got 10 on top and bottom here. So I think what I'm gonna do is just heat this up and then come in and hammer in at an angle to just bring these kind of chamfers in a little bit more and hopefully avoid messing up the teeth that we've got and slim that down a little bit more. I think that looks a lot more proportional than how wide that jawline was at first. And the last thing I'm gonna do is just kind of add a little chin for this little guy. And I'm gonna do that just by bringing it to the far edge of the anvil and hammering down and checking every time so I'm not bouncing around too far forward or too far back and knock his teeth out. And I'll go ahead and put in a nice little chamfer here under the chin. And then I'll just heat it up just a little bit and give it a nice brushing and get rid of all that scale. I'll use a finer wire brush to get into the eye sockets and the nasal passages and between the teeth and everything in there. That is how to forge a skull. And I think all in all, it turned out pretty all right. However, there is a little bit of lack of realism, obviously, in that the face is way down here and the back of the skull is kind of up, offset off the face. If you wanted to go more realistic, you would have to use smaller tools, but you could hammer it in really right into the main bulk of the mass of the skull itself, and that would turn out a little more realistic. However, I think this still turned out really nice looking. Now I just have to figure out what I want to forge this piece of steel into. I'm thinking maybe a ladle or a barbecue fork or even a fire poker if I can get enough mass out of it. I doubt I can get that much length, but I think it'll be a lot of fun to figure out a good project to suit this, this little skull. Now, that is going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, or ring that notification bell. If you want to support me in the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link is in the description below the video. Or please consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel. And as always, keep on rocking.